Welcome to Planet Lex, the podcast of Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, with your host, Dean Daniel B. Rodriguez, bringing it to you from Chicago, Illinois. Take it away, Dan.
Hello, and welcome to Northwestern Law's Planet Lex, podcasting from the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law in Chicago, Illinois. My name is Dan Rodriguez, your host. Been looking forward to this panel for a while on cannabis and the law. And joining me today to talk about the complicated legal issues surrounding the burgeoning cannabis industry are Charlie Bachtell, founder and CEO of Cresco Labs, and Dina Rollman, Chief Compliance Counsel at Green Thumb Industries. Charlie is an attorney and corporate executive with expertise in regulatory compliance. Before he founded Cresco Labs, he served as the executive vice president and general counsel of Guaranteed Rate, the seventh largest mortgage bank in the nation. Cresco Labs operates 3 cannabis cultivation centers in Illinois, 1 in Puerto Rico. They will soon launch operations in the state of Washington and in Pennsylvania. He was the founding member of both the Illinois Cannabis Bar Association and the Medical Cannabis Alliance of Illinois, and he teaches a course in our Master of Science in Law program on legal and regulatory issues in cannabis. Before moving into this space, Dina Rollman was a commercial litigation partner at Sperling and Slater, representing individuals and businesses in a broad range of complex commercial disputes. At Green Thumb Industries, or GTI, she monitors and ensures full compliance with state and federal laws pertaining to GTI's multi-state cultivation and dispensary operations. GTI operates cannabis cultivation centers in Illinois and Nevada, and will be opening 2 more in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. They also operate, or will soon operate, 8 retail dispensaries in 5 states. Dina is the founder and president of Illinois Women in Cannabis, and she graduated from Northwestern Law in 2000 and teaches a course on cannabis law at Chicago Kent College of Law. Charlie and Dina, thank you for joining me. Let me begin, if I can, by asking you to describe in a nutshell these 2 fascinating companies that you're part of, Cresco Labs. Why don't you go first, Charlie, and then to learn about GTI.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me today. Excited to be here. So a little bit about Cresco Labs. We founded the organization in 2013 when the law came to Illinois. A regulated medical cannabis program was passed here. So looked at the industry for the first time then, was immediately fascinated by it, and knew that this was something that me and my partner's prior skill sets would be well suited for, and really bringing a new look to the way that medical cannabis programs ran. And we were fortunate enough to be successful in the licensing process here in Illinois and in additional states subsequently.
And around the same time when the Illinois law went into effect, was just fascinated by the idea that this statute that was passed by the legislature would overnight create a brand new industry in Illinois that had never existed before. And it was going to be highly regulated. I could see the role that lawyers were going to need to play to make sure that this was going to be done well and legally. And so I got involved with the principal founders of GTI back 3 years ago, helped them with their application process. They were successful, and immediately there was sort of an endless need for legal support as they ramped up operations in Illinois and then in other states.
Were either or both of you involved in the political battle to bring medical use of cannabis here in Illinois?
I was not.
Not in Illinois, no.
So it's a new industry, cannabis industry, by any measure. It's been only 2 decades since California became the first state to legalize medical cannabis. And at last count, approximately half of the states in the United States, maybe more than half, have either licensed and regulated medical cannabis, or in the case of a growing number of states, cannabis for recreational use. So could you say a little bit about how those laws have come about and how they came to Illinois, to give us a sense of the political landscape in this area?
Sure. Well, Illinois is a little bit unusual in that our entire program was legislatively created, whereas what you see on the West Coast and some other states are voter initiatives, where it's sort of, the will of the people that decides that a state is going to have a regulated program. In Illinois, it was actually a bipartisan bill, which is hard to picture these days, signed into law by then Governor Quinn. Mm-hmm. And, our law in Illinois is a product of a lot of political negotiation and compromise. In other states, again, the approach has really been different, where really all the decisions have to be hashed out and the compromise is made when they're deciding what the ballot initiative language will be. And that's the really hard part. And then once you've got your language ready to go, then you put it to the voters. And at that point, the politicians are out of it.
Mm-hmm. So in Illinois specifically, you mentioned Governor Quinn, but it was actually our current governor, Governor Rauner, who awarded the first medical marijuana licenses. And it's such a new industry. It's brand new in Illinois, as is the regulatory infrastructure that brings it about. So for both of you and your companies, how do you navigate and negotiate the regulators in Illinois, given how inexperienced they are in this industry?
So I think it's an interesting dynamic that was created here in Illinois at inception and currently with the regulatory environment. It was, as Dina was mentioning, this law came about based on Illinois truly trying to create a very medicinally focused medical cannabis program, which, unfortunately wasn't the case in most of the pioneering markets that have been around for a lot longer. So, as is the case with a lot of industries that were relatively unregulated and then become regulated, it's a matter of first impression. They're trying to solve as many of the perceived issues as they can. Oftentimes the pendulum can swing a little bit too far. And I would say the experience in working with the regulators post-operation here in Illinois has been one of an incredible amount of cooperation, which has been great. It's new to them. It's new to us. The operators here in Illinois, they did and I guess it's a biased opinion being one of the two of the successful groups. I think they did a wonderful job in picking very professional organizations who have the best outcome in mind for the patients of Illinois and were responsible and approach it with a very professional perspective. So we have a really good working professional relationship with the regulators that's very collaborative.
Has there been much of a role in the origin of the law, but in particular in the implementation of the law in the medical industry? And how's the medical industry? We're talking about medical marijuana, or marijuana for medical use, right? So how has the medical industry been involved, if at all, in this?
Really very little, unfortunately. The way the law was written and the way the initial doctor certification forms came out, doctors were being asked to sign a form saying that they, in their professional opinion, thought that the patient would benefit from the use of medical cannabis and that the benefits would outweigh any risks. And, we have to all understand that doctors don't study medical cannabis in medical school. And so doctors initially were very hesitant to get involved and felt like they were being asked to put their professional reputation and license on the line without adequate education or support.
And to be clear, none of the doctors, as I understand the legislation, none of the doctors were required to issue any of these licenses.
Absolutely. It's completely elective. And so many doctors opted out initially. And it was only less than a year ago that the doctor certification form was changed. Governor Rauner did go along with this, fortunately, where they deleted that language about the doctor's professional opinion. And so now the doctor is just certifying whether or not the patient does in fact have a qualifying condition. That has really increased doctor participation. However, there's still a long way to go. There are a lot of doctors who still feel like they really don't know enough about the program. They don't know enough about medical cannabis. They're just not willing to take the risk. They're also concerned about, the interaction of medical cannabis with other drugs a patient might be taking. And, they're risk averse naturally. And so some are still opting out until there's more education and information available.
This may be an unfair question to ask both of you. You are lawyers, not doctors. But even though this is a new industry in many respects, the other side of the coin is many states, California the first, but many other states have been at this for quite a while. So we have some experience in these various states, not only with respect to regulation, but a growing body of medical research. So what is the current sort of state of understanding in a couple of sentences about the benefits and the risks of medical cannabis?
I'd say unfortunately it's more limited than anybody would like, because while there's a ton of anecdotal research and data that's available from a FDA-approved, double-blind, placebo-controlled study perspective, very, very limited in the United States. It's a Schedule I, and it's very difficult to do FDA-approved research on a Schedule I drug. However, research from around the world, Israel's been at the forefront of this, other countries, the United Kingdom, some in Spain, they've been doing research for a couple decades, and the research it's compelling. And finally, I would say even within the United States, not from a controlled study with, again, double-blind, placebo-controlled study, but from a data perspective, finally enough data is being aggregated, and the studies that are coming out on the data showing the correlations and causations between medical cannabis being in your state, particularly with the opiate issue that's going around in America. A lot of data. One of the studies published by JAMA came out, I believe, a year and a half ago or so, showing a correlation between a reduction in opiate abuse in states that have active medical cannabis programs. And again, the data is compelling, 25% reduction on average. So that sort of information is starting to come out, but we're still lacking in the laboratory and medical research perspective. Hopefully that'll change, but it's a scheduling issue.
I'll note that on the websites of both of your organizations, there are some wonderful links to some of the research that's been done and some of the values. I'll also notice, this information comes out fast and furiously within the media and often with resort to scientific information. Just last week, as I understand it, there's been some attention drawn to the connection between medical cannabis and brain injuries in former athletes, which has also gained some notoriety. Let me ask, sticking with the theme of this new regulatory infrastructure for these issues and the challenges it faces. Charlie, you were in the banking industry, and so I'm sure you know this from that perspective, and both of you know there's a challenge with respect to banking, given the reliance on federal regulation and insurance and all of that. I had a student do a paper for me in a class just this last semester that really illuminated for me the major challenges of dealing with the financial aspects of all of this, given the fact that the banking industry and banks themselves are generally not prepared for all of this. And so how is that unfolding in the state of Illinois?
Illinois is actually better situated than many states in that there are, a few, and when I say few, less than 3 banks willing to bank the industry. State chartered banks that understand the compliance hurdles are willing to take them on and sort of dedicate all the extra effort that they need to expend in order to stay in compliance, having cannabis companies as customers. How
do they deal with the insurance issues, right? That's been a stumbling block, right? The ability to have FDIC-provided insurance for their banking.
So that's I wouldn't say it's a misnomer. It's definitely a concern, but banks are allowed to do this. There's been guidance provided by FinCEN and the Department of Justice back in 2014 encouraging banks to do this. While the idea of a cash business might sound fun to some people, it's not. That's not how business works. And in an industry, especially dealing with this subject matter, the idea of having large amounts of cash being stored in retail storefronts or elsewhere is not good. So as we're moving forward,
it's not safe.
So as we're moving forward with creating this regulated industry, this new industry, banking is critical to it. So there was advice, there was recommendations and direction provided by FinCEN a couple of years ago, but it still is it's a lift to get, especially any federally chartered, publicly traded institutions to want to participate until that scheduling changes. But to Dina's point, especially in the newer states, what we consider sort of generation 2 of medical cannabis, highly regulated, super compliance focused, you'll find banks that are willing to participate in this. But, it comes at a premium. There's additional costs and expenses and resources that they have to put into the compliance component to be compliant, and that cost gets passed on to the operators.
Maybe this is an unfair question given your previous hat, but you see any prospect the guaranteed rate will be in this business, or we prefer not to comment?
It's not a depository institution,
good.
So no.
Good.
And just to Charlie's point, GTI and Cresco both just were awarded cultivation and processing licenses in the state of Pennsylvania, and we were awarded those in June and have until December to build and become operational with 50,000 square foot cultivation facilities. Then you're going to start transporting product to dispensaries. As of right now, there's not a bank that's come forward in the state of Pennsylvania to bank the industry. So, this is something where in each state you have to solve the problem all over again. The regulators there are very concerned about this. They see that there's going to be this overnight new industry, massive amounts of cash moving around the state. And they are working in cooperation with us, keeping the lines of communication open, trying to see if anybody can find banks that will bank the industry.
So another potential legal challenge you face beyond banking regards taxes. Marijuana companies can't write off taxes in the same way as other businesses. There's a section 280E of the tax code, which, as I understand it, forbids businesses from recording tax deductions or credits for income associated with Schedule I and Schedule II substances in the Controlled Substance Acts, of which cannabis is one, Section 1 substance. Could you say a bit about what the issue is and how, if at all, you surmount it?
Sure. So that provision in the tax code is a good example of another one of the unfortunate impacts on this industry due to the scheduling of cannabis as a Schedule I and the shelf that it sits on next to other drugs that have no medicinal value, which at this point I think is a pretty well proven or at least accepted perspective that cannabis should not be sitting on that shelf. So you mentioned the IRC code 280E. It does prevent you from being able to write off any business expense other than the cost of goods sold. So while it's less of an issue for cultivation operators because the vast majority of our expenses are cost of goods sold on the retail level, it definitely can impact a business. I've heard, and by no means am I a tax expert, but I've heard it equate to an effective tax rate north of 70% compared to a traditional business. So it's one of the things, along with banking, that needs to get figured out if this is going to be the industry that this should be. It needs the support on a federal level with some direction on banking and taxation. It should be treated no differently than any other business.
Is there proposed legislation currently now?
There is.
There regularly is. I mean, this is one of those issues that's impacted this industry for a while and unnecessarily.
The other tax implication is that probably most business owners don't necessarily expect to be under IRS audit, whereas I think when you have a business in this industry, I mean, we're still fairly young as a company, but you sort of go into the business expecting a fine-tooth comb through every aspect of your business by the IRS, which is just another burden on a business that, non-cannabis businesses don't have.
Both of your companies and, of course, your own professional experiences come out of Illinois, and I'm intrigued by you mentioning your expansion into Pennsylvania. This is a state-by-state movement,
yes.
And barring unforeseen circumstances, in a couple moments I'll raise some of those unforeseen circumstances, namely the federal government, we can see this development expanding in other states, or there's a prospect of it. Are you equipped professionally, or your company's equipped to really expand the scope of your work and enterprises throughout the United States or to many, many other states outside of Illinois and now Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of you lose all the benefits that a normal company would have, where you could have, a headquarters and then transport product across state lines, scale your operation in one central place and open up satellites. Instead, you really have to recreate your business in each state and have, again, like a cultivation facility built from the ground up in each state and dispensaries in each state. Get that banking relationship, get the insurance, staff your employees, find local counsel. You're sort of really reinventing the wheel.
And that's just, if I may, that's unique to cannabis because of its status, right? I mean, in any other aspect, let's say agriculture, you don't have to worry about that, right? There's interstate movement of goods. It's not like one state says only tomatoes in our state and you can't grow it in any other or distribute it in any other state.
Absolutely. And it really hits you when you have a facility that's, right on the border of another state. And if you wanted to expand your operations into that state, you literally would have to recreate everything and start from scratch all over again. You cannot transport cannabis across state lines.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that dynamic is one of the issues that makes it very difficult for any company to really have a multi-state national footprint objective, and that's why you'll only find a few companies that are actually able to do it so far. So I think GTI and ourselves it was part of the plan. It was part of the plan from the beginning.
Now, the other side of the coin is, again, taking a state like California that has, relatively speaking, a fairly mature industry. I noticed that neither of your companies do business in California, right? Is that because of that point? Is there mature industries and businesses that do it, or is there something else?
No, I think California might appear mature just because of the length of time that they've had a law on the books. But from a regulated cannabis perspective, it's not even born yet. January 1st of 18 will be when the true regulations finally come into California. So it's interesting. A lot of the more pioneering states out there had a different initial approach to medical cannabis than Generation 1. So it's different than what you've seen in Generation 2, and they're having to play a little bit of catch up. Illinois did a great job of sort of changing the game and changing the way that states thought about regulation and setting up, really true industries that are able to be regulated, a format, a structure that's able to be regulated. And now you're seeing some of those states out west have to catch up and implement some of the structure that Illinois was one of the first, if not the first state to create.
One of the keys to being able to regulate this industry is limiting the amount of licenses. Regulators are state employees. They have to oversee a certain number of cultivation and dispensary facilities in a given day. And if you've got a state like California that's massive with an unlimited number of licenses, or Colorado where we see that there are now more dispensaries than there are Starbucks, that's very challenging for a state regulator to really feel like they understand what's happening at that business. Is the security system working? Is there any diversion happening, et cetera? Whereas in Illinois, what they purposely did was they said, okay, we have 21 police districts in this state. We're going to have one cultivation facility per police district. That way, no particular police district is overwhelmed by trying to keep an eye on what's happening at this facility. For the regulators, 21 licenses to oversee statewide. They've shown they can handle that. It's not overwhelming them. So California, it's the Wild West in so many respects that I don't think most companies that are really comfortable now operating in a highly regulated market, I think are actually really uncomfortable operating in such an unregulated market.
Well, let me press that point. One of the reasons why there's that's the Wild West in many respects, and the example that you use about more dispensaries and Starbucks is there's so much money in it. So I guess the question for you for Illinois and I guess Pennsylvania is that cap or limit sustainable in a marketplace in which folks really press for licenses and, of course, would have to press for changes in the legislation because they're leaving money on the table? In other words, do you encounter folks who are saying, no fair, these guys got in and got these valuable licenses, they're so valuable, we've got to open it up?
I think when you're dealing with this subject matter and you have the dynamic between federal and state law, ensuring a controlled, regulated environment is a wonderful counter, I guess, to the position of this needs to be open, this needs to be more accessible, it needs to be controlled, and it needs to be incredibly highly regulated in order to stay in compliance with the guidance that the federal government has given. Similar to the FinCEN memo that I mentioned earlier, the Department of Justice came out with guidance back in 2013 with regard to states that were going to implement any type of program, medical or adult use related to cannabis. And 8 priorities that the federal government identified and said, if a state is willing to come up with a regulatory framework that addresses our federal government's 8 priorities and they put their money where their mouth is and they enforce our 8 priorities, we'll defer to the states to enforce our 8 priorities. We have bigger and better things to worry about. If the state can't ensure that they're complying and enforcing the 8 priorities of the federal government, that would put the entire program and any state law at jeopardy for federal intervention.
So let me throw out a provocative question. Is there a possible, built on what you said and the relative acquiescence on the part of the federal government, is there a real potential wedge between the medical cannabis industry, which again, by and large, has enjoyed acquiescence by the feds, and recreational marijuana, in which what we read and what we learn and indeed what we know on the part of the current Department of Justice is, it may be Wild West, but you guys are at risk. The feds might, in fact, step in, and they're sure as heck not going to pass laws that put an imprimatur on the use of recreational marijuana. So you have 2 industries, right? They're both cannabis, but one is recreational marijuana, highly disfavored by the current administration, and there's medical cannabis, which is a different story. How do you navigate that divide, if at all?
Well, one of the interesting concepts sitting here in the law school that comes up again and again now in this industry is federalism. And it's really interesting to see the way that, some of the more conservative viewpoints in our country generally tend to favor states' rights, except when it comes to something like this, and then suddenly they don't want to respect what the states have done. We're in a situation now where, as you said, more than half of the states have voted on this. The people have spoken. When you've got a state the size of Colorado with a population like that, legalizing adult use, there's not a lot of political momentum to support the federal government stepping in and overruling what voters in more than half of the states and legislators in more than half of the states have voted for. So that's, I think, one arrow that the industry feels it has is that at this point, there is no political mandate to turn back the clock on this. There's an evolution happening. Medical, as you said, is so widely supported at this point. I think it's really just not even controversial anymore. You're even seeing like really conservative southern states look at this now and pass even, it might be a limited medical program, but they're giving some type of medical cannabis access to their residents.
Well, if I may just press that, in some of the states, you mentioned the southern states and others that have really embraced in a bipartisan way the use of medical marijuana. For many of those political officials, whether for ideological reasons or otherwise, they said this is not recreational use, and we're going to be very, very wary of expanding that scope. So I guess you'd agree that in some ways the medical cannabis debate is just really a separate debate from these sorts of issues? Let me be clear, from the issues that arise in connection with the potential attack on recreational marijuana.
I think you could, and you don't even have to infer it, I think you've seen the actual distinction be drawn by members of the current administration on a federal level. Mm-hmm. Support for medical, not necessarily support for adult use. So the distinctions, it's there.
Come back to the point about what we don't know given the state of research. Could sort of the winds of support change if we do come to learn a lot more about, for example, to channel General Sessions that maybe marijuana is a gateway drug to the opioid epidemic, right? And the connection between marijuana, even medical cannabis, and the opioid epidemic, or how states regulate intoxication in driving, which implicates not only folks with recreational use, but medical use. I mean, the series of issues. If we learn a lot more about the damaging effects of marijuana, do you think the winds of politics would change around?
I think the inverse of that is the reality of it. I think we've lived in a state where, for decades, where that's the assumed research, and the research that's come out in the last 5 to 10 years is reversing the position. So I think the inverse is true, that the research that's coming out is showing that cannabis is not the gateway drug, and the alternative, it's actually, it tends to be prescription drugs that are the gateway drug to the opiate abuse in America now. So I think we've lived for decades and generations with the idea of that being the issue, and now the research is disproving it.
The other thing I think would be relevant for this adult use conversation is taxes. I think that's sort of, it's not even the elephant in the room. It's one of the primary drivers where states, they might be holding their nose and they might not like adult use, but when they see the tax revenue that a state like Colorado is enjoying, and you've got a broke state like Illinois or many other states that are really struggling, can they hold their nose and say, it's worth it, it's going to help us, build infrastructure, fund our schools, and do things like that are really good for the people of our state. If alcohol is legal, can we hold our nose and legalize adult use?
Well, I have a wacky theory, and your last comment allows me to have the listeners indulge it, and that is, even in some red states, what that extraordinary access to tax revenue might do is give effect or promise that the state could get rid of the income tax, could significantly lower their tax burden. So it's not only providing more social services, but reduce all these bad, nasty taxes that they've been campaigning against for all these years.
Seems possible. And again, that's where there's just a real nice synergy with, a lot of states that are the sort of more red states that believe in states' rights. And if that's their choice to do that, even if they're fans of Jeff Sessions, do they really want somebody sitting in Washington, D.C. telling them how to manage their state?
Mm-hmm.
I think you could take the discussion even a step further too. The tax revenue is sort of the shiny object in the room, but it turns out that it's really the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the economic impact of a more progressive or accessible view on cannabis. Revenue generation is one thing, cost elimination is another, social justice impact is another. So like I mentioned that study earlier that shows on average a 25% reduction in opiate abuse in states that have access to medical cannabis. If you take a look at Medicaid expense related to prescription opiates that are then abused, if you could reduce that 25%. If you look at the criminal justice expense associated with prosecuting opiate abuse in the state, and you can reduce that by 25%.
Not to mention the impact on mass incarceration.
Mass incarceration, the sort of disproportionate impact on certain communities within a state when it comes to mass incarceration. You start seeing that the tip of the iceberg is the tax revenue. There's a lot more underneath it.
So here's what I'm curious about. Since we're talking about marijuana, are there unique and special issues of security? I mean, you're in your work, you're surrounded by marijuana.
Well, just to clarify, so Charlie and I both are in our corporate offices. There's no marijuana around anywhere.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
And if the regulators are listening, please know there's no cannabis there.
Great.
But in the facilities where we cultivate it, for both of our companies, it's outside of Chicago. These are sort of in more remote parts of the state.
We won't give the listeners the benefit of the addresses of those companies.
Good idea. What I like to say is, picture a Costco facility. Everyone's been to a Costco store. But inside that Costco store are different production areas. So there's rooms where the plants are growing. There's rooms where the plant is taken from its plant state and cut up and processed into the sort of small little bits of smokable flower that people use. And then there's a laboratory in the facility that's where they're transforming that plant matter into the different edibles you might have, or oils or tinctures or patches, and sort of a limitless iteration of products. Everything that is happening in that facility, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is under camera surveillance. And when I say it's under camera surveillance, I mean that there are cameras in every single part of that facility except for the locker rooms and the bathrooms. And not only do we as the employer have access to a bank of screens to show everything happening in the facility, every nook and cranny of that facility at all times, but also the Illinois State Police have a login. And so they also, at any time that they want, can log in and see exactly what's happening in our facility. So that is a key point that we make to new employees when we hire them, and it's an ongoing point that is emphasized in employee training And it's really built into the culture that while it may be tempting to some to be, in a facility surrounded by medical cannabis, if that's why you think you want to work in a facility, you are sorely mistaken, because, the most likely scenario if you were ever tempted to take any medical cannabis out of the facility is not just that you would lose your job, but, you'd also have the Illinois State Police at your door shortly thereafter.
So any potential employee who has a nostalgic notion of growing some pot in their dorm room closet, this might not be the best job for them.
This is different.
Those of us in the industry think it's a little over the top, in that, it almost feels like you're working like a nuclear waste facility, for how highly regulated it is, and it's treated with such seriousness, where, people from sort of a different outlook or different experience in other states like California, where they have outdoor grows in Humboldt County, they really can't fathom the level of security that we have in these facilities.
Great. Thanks. Thank you. That's very interesting. So here's a question for the both of you. You didn't come from this background. By this background, I mean in cannabis law. Obviously, there wasn't that area of law in Illinois. But both of you got in on the ground floor, as it were, right? In a highly restricted, highly regulated, open marketplace for licenses. You had the good judgment to be able to advance forward and get these licenses early on. What did you know that other folks with your training, your background, your skill level, your smarts didn't know to be able to get in truly on the ground floor?
Well, I didn't know anything about cannabis, and I had never done an RFP. But what I had learned to do over the course of 10 years at a litigation firm was learn how to put together a compelling story in a brief, put together summary judgment briefs where you've got a million exhibits, you're making your case, learning to put together that package that stands for your position and why you should win. And I just felt like somehow I could translate that skill to the application and tell the GTI story. I could get all the subject matter expertise I needed from our Colorado partner, who actually was operating cultivation and dispensary facilities. So I didn't need to know that. I just needed that content, and then how to shape the story and shape sort of the sell of why we win.
So you're not telling me that a Northwestern law professor at some point said, if medical cannabis ever becomes legal in Illinois, here's how you should make an argument in favor of a license.
Not at all. But I think I was an English major in college, and I feel like even now as a cannabis lawyer, a lot of what I do is writing. And I think if you can build that skill of learning to write well and persuasively, it translates to everything.
And Charlie?
Yeah, I think it's not a different story than Dina's. Being in the mortgage banking space before this, transactional and regulatory focused, to me, this process, well, one, when we first came across it, when the law was passed here, it was, I think within 48 hours, I realized this was the most fascinating thing that I ever looked into. I didn't know what to expect. My preconceived notion of what medical cannabis was, Venice Beach popped into my head. And then reading the law here when it was passed was dynamically different and a lot more in line with things that I was currently doing in my current profession. So then when it came to the application writing time, similar to Dina, it was putting the pieces together. You looked at it like a summary judgment brief. I looked at it like an audit. And I think at the time that I did the application here in Illinois, I was probably one of less than 10 attorneys in the country that had been through 2 CFPB audits with no faults. So for me, it was very similar to being audited by a state or being audited by the federal government at my prior place of employment. And for perspective, those were 60,000 pages of documents that we were turning over, whereas this application, while it was still large, was 4,500. So very familiar with that process. And you mentioned the persuasive component of it. Messaging is big in anything you do when you're trying to persuade anybody, whether it's in the legal field or you're in sales or, really any industry. Understanding who your audience is, drafting the message that relates best to the audience, it's a critical component to success.
And having had that success, there's no question that both of you had a huge leg up when Pennsylvania was issuing those licenses, right? And you had that experience in Illinois, I assume, that carried you forward in Pennsylvania.
The unique component of it now is the experience to go along with it. So not only are we attorneys in the industry, but we've got 2+ years of operating experience under our belt too. So the message gets stronger.
Well, lest you cultivate, if you'll pardon the expression, an image as a carpetbagger when you go into Pennsylvania, you might want to leave your Bears and Cubs and White Sox jerseys at home.
Good point. Thanks.
Sure. In the short time we have remaining, let me shift the focus, if I may, to the day-to-day and the week-to-week professional life that a lawyer would have in this industry. So both of you made mid-career adjustments or early career adjustments, as it were, in that direction. Many of your students that you're teaching at law schools and others might say, I'd like to go into that line of business. What opportunities are there for young lawyers and those schooled in law who may not be lawyers to go into this business?
I think there's so many opportunities. That's part of why I was so excited to teach a law course on this topic.
Limitless.
Really, I mean, it's sort of cannabis and fill in the blank. So if you're a real estate attorney, you're absolutely going to encounter a situation where your client owns commercial property and wants to consider leasing it to a dispensary or cultivation facility and wants to understand the implications of that. If you're an employment attorney, you need to be able to counsel employers on how they should adjust their policies to take into account the fact that some of their employees undoubtedly are going to be or already are medical cannabis patients. If you're a transactional attorney, get involved, start helping these companies do their, offering memoranda, operating agreements, licensing agreements, mergers, acquisitions. There's all of that activity happening in the industry. And go from there. It's just endless. And not to mention my background, which was litigation. I think we're just in the very early days of this industry and we're not seeing a huge amount of litigation, but I think that's always an inevitable consequence of having a new industry like this, and especially when it's so largely funded by private money. And so you're seeing a lot of investor groups that are friends and family, and everybody thinks everything's going to go well and everyone's going to get rich. And sure enough, not everybody's going to. And there's going to be a lot of litigation down the road.
So do you envision law firms, maybe small, medium-sized, and even large law firms, having areas of the firm devoted to practice in the cannabis industry?
Well, it's happening already, for sure. There are entire law firms that, bill themselves as marijuana law firms. And then even in Chicago, we're seeing small and mid-sized firms starting to build those practices and wanting to build that cross-state expertise because they understand that it's not enough to know how to represent cannabis clients in one state. Inevitably, one state operation is going to bleed into other states. And so law firms that have multiple offices across the country are developing cross-office practice groups to service clients.
I think a good way to understand it, the way that I describe it to people when I'm explaining the industry, and that's so interesting, it's so new. At the end of the day, it's sort of an aggregation of a lot of traditional industries just in a slightly different package. I mean, it's commercial agriculture, it's manufacturing, it's product formulation, it's packaging, it's logistics, it's HR, it's accounting, it's legal, it's, all of the things that are associated with normal industries. This is just a new industry that incorporates all of those different pieces. So if there's a legal need for any entity, cannabis companies need it too. A website, merchandising, all of those things.
It's a new industry, but it's pot. So how do you, and yourselves and with students you'd counsel, convince them to resist the stoner jokes and the reputation and the snickers from folks who would say, wow, these guys are dope lawyers?
I think there's probably more of an issue 3 years ago than it is today. Whenever I have a conversation, whenever I engage in any sort of conversation or discussion with anybody about the industry, it's met with a lot more openness and receptiveness to, granted, there's always the initial joke. I'm surprised that nobody asked if we brought fee samples today. That seems to be the one that you still get regularly. But
I want to say on behalf of the university that had you done that, I would have sent you away. But I heard a rumor.
Uh-oh.
I heard a rumor that
he's looking at you, Dina.
That well, maybe I didn't hear the rumor about you, Dina, but I'm pointing my finger at Charlie. Is that from your, and you may not want to comment on this, is that you do not encourage your employees to be active users of cannabis, that actually there's some rules and regulations in your own companies about that. You may care to comment about it, but
sure.
I guess
No, I mean, again, recreational use isn't legal in Illinois.
That's really what I'm talking about.
And without a doubt, when you're operating in any industry, when you're under a microscope, it's very important to be beyond reproach. Mm-hmm. And so it's I'm not a consumer myself. I'm not a patient in the program. We do have patients that work in our organization, but for the most part, again, I go back to this is commercial agriculture, manufacturing, product formulation, et cetera. It's a traditional business with a different subject matter.
That's our show for today. I want to thank Dina and Charlie for joining me here this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. I'm Dan Rodriguez, signing off from Northwestern Cresco School of Law.
If you'd like more information about today's show, please visit law.northwestern.edu/planetlex or legaltalknetwork.com. Subscribe via iTunes and RSS. Find both Northwestern Pritzker School of Law and Legal Talk Network on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Or download the free app from Legal Talk Network in Google Play and iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Northwestern University, Legal Talk Network, or their respective officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.